So do you want to start it off, or should I?
Yeah, we're back. They said we never return. They said we never show our faces again.
Not that we're showing our faces, but
we stuck to that one.
yeah.
But this is going to be episode 2 of EDHTakes, and I am Elijah Samuelson, and this is my associate,
Svetchcook.
And today we're going to talk about something that we're both pretty enthusiastic about.
For sure.
And that's having plays in the first 2 turns of the game, because I think everyone can agree it feels terrible to feel like you're not contributing to a game of Commander, especially like depending on how long your games go, like that can be quite a few turns between like 4 players. But before going into that, really, we wanted to kind of touch on what our mission statement on the podcast was going to be, because we didn't clarify that so much in the first episode. But the idea of EDHTakes is overall to refute commonly held opinions about Commander while trying to bring more like different perspectives and other people's opinions to various discussions in the format, like things like certain kind of color combinations maybe being bad, or just like things about the social contract, or like Rule 0. We're going to talk about various hot button issues like that, and maybe like later on, like we've had like a lot of discussion lately on like social media about mono white in Commander, or like the design of white cards. And so maybe that'll be something we talk about later on, or touch on every once in a while.
Yeah, and one thing we do plan on, incorporating is we've got some people that, definitely have differing opinions from us in our area that we probably want to get on and have discussions with on the air. So that'd be probably interesting to get some live, discussion or debate or whatever about some Commander topics.
Yeah, because I think we both agree in a format like Commander, like other constructed formats, you can say are more easily solved, and it's easier to kind of assess like whether an opinion is right or wrong. But like Commander is just so large that there can be so many, like, such a variety of opinions on like what is viable, what's not viable, like what is fun, what's not fun. So many things are more subjective than objective in Commander.
Yeah, and the social aspect of the format combined with the multiplayer aspect of the format kind of exponentially increases the complexity. So it makes it really hard to just kind of like be very matter of fact with your opinions. So something I like to do a lot is I'm kind of I don't have super strong opinions. Like I have opinions, but like I'm willing to change them if I have good,
Absolutely.
opposition.
I think everyone should be willing to change their opinions when presented with new information. I think it's a very healthy and adult thing to do. And what I like to say is there's a saying that nobody knows everything, but everybody knows something. So I like to try and know the most somethings that I can.
Yeah. Well, anyway, moving on from the like mission statement of the podcast, we probably should start talking about the topic of the show, which, as you mentioned, was early mana plays, competing with Sol Ring, of course.
Yeah. Is this better than Sol Ring?
That's a thing you often think of it yourself, when if you like discover a really powerful early drop and you're like, you always compare it to Sol Ring, because Sol Ring is the quintessential, go-to early, play in Commander. And I just to specify, in this episode we're going to be talking about early plays, not 1 and 2 drops, but not 1 mana and 2 mana cost spells, but things that you play on turn 1 or 2. Because, something like a Swords of Plowshares or, like a counter spell are very good 1 mana and 2 mana spells, but you don't play them on turn 1 or 2.
Yeah, like you can look at a deck list on a site like Tapped Out or something, and it'll show you have this many 2 drops in your deck, or like this many 2 mana spells. But if half of those are, instants and sorceries that like don't work on an empty board, like you're not really like spending that out on turn 2 necessarily. Yeah,
and so we think it's really important to kind of bake some consistency of early plays into your deck. Commander is like often a format of like big and splashy spells, but and a lot of people think that you don't want to play a lot of 1 and 2 drops because in the late game they're not great.
Yeah, I've seen that argument a lot. Like, I'm somebody who likes to play a lot of like 1 or 2 CMC creatures in my decks, but people will always make this argument like if you're sticking up for a low CMC spell, they're like, well, this isn't gonna impact your you're bored. Like, if you can top deck this later in the game, then it's not going to do enough for you. And I think that mentality is kind of a result of maybe sometimes poor deck building. Like, if you're evaluating how things are, like, when you top deck them all the time, you probably just need to add more consistency into your deck and, like, more card advantage.
Yeah, because oftentimes, like, as long as you're not playing, like, terrible 1 and 2 drops, like, drawing them late in the game, unless it's literally the only card you're drawing, like the only card in your hand, like they're good. They fit into a curve. They still do the thing that you put them in your deck to do. They're usually pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think talking about Sol Ring specifically, like we were saying, Commander is the format of big splashy spells, and I think Sol Ring is a card that like kind of makes people feel like they can skip past that developing stage of the game sometimes in their deck building, because they're like, well, if I have turn 1 Sol Ring, then I'm playing my 4-drop on turn 2. And you can kind of cut out sections of your curve based on like this mentality of like, maybe I'll have Sol Ring.
Yeah, but and excluding mulligans, you only have turn 1 Sol Ring about 8% of the time. If you include more Sol Ring-ish cards, like more 1-drops that are good on turn 1, you can kind of approach a much higher percentage of games that you have like a good turn 1 opener. So I think if you go to about 5 good turn 1 plays in your deck.
Isn't it like going from like 8% to like 35%?
Yeah, it's about 8 to 35, 34% if you count in like having the lands to play them. And if you want to count like having at least 2 lands in your opening hand, it goes down to like, I think it's around 29%. But it's a significant increase to about a third of the games, maybe about 1 in every 3 or 4 games that you have like a good turn 1 play that like can start you off in the game. And if you include like 1 mana or 2 mana plays in that, like the odds go up even higher to like, you can with like 15 1 or 2 mana plays, you can go up to like 80% to play something before turn 3.
Yeah, and like to refute like when people say that thing about like top decking low CMC spells later in the game, like that's something that is maybe going to happen, but like your opening hand and like your mulligans, like that's something you have to deal with every game you play. Like that's going to happen. Like you have to worry about that. So if you have a bunch of like 4 and 5 CMC spells in your deck, or like even those huge like 7, 8, 9 converted mana cost spells, you don't want to be seeing a lot of those in your opening hands. And I just think it's healthier to want to do more in the early game, because you know that you're gonna be in the game at that point.
For sure. So we've moving on. We've compiled kind of a list of powerful turn 1 plays that set you up in the game very early on by either providing you card draw, ramp, early aggression, like pressuring players, or like an early synergy piece that can let you get your game plan going faster. And I think we're going to start with the white cards first. I mean...
yeah, we have this kind of broken up by colors of, like, 1-drops. And some of these cards, we're going to... This is not a totally genuine opinion. What we're going to say, maybe, is this better than Sol Ring in an opening hand? And the answer is, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. Obviously, Sol Ring is very powerful, but some of these cards in certain opening hands can... you'll be happier with this card than a Sol Ring.
This is my personal opinion, and maybe it's not totally correct, but I will be happier to see an opening hand with a land tax than a Sol Ring most of the time, because I feel like I can keep a very land light or like a 1-land hand with land tax. As long as I'm not going first, it will just allowing you to hit your land drop every turn of the game, like guaranteed, and thin your deck out that early on. It adds a lot of consistency to your game, and it lets you keep a lot of extra gas in your opening hand.
Yeah, and land tax was actually the card that sparked the idea of this episode, because we thought about land tax and we were like, I guess this is kind of better than Sol Ring sometimes, and maybe there's more cards that could compete with that, or at least be on the level of Sol Ring on turn 1. So
yeah, like with a 1-land hand with land tax versus 1-land hand with Sol Ring, you have to have at least like one other support card, like card draw or something.
Yeah, like a cultivate or something,
to make the Sol Ring hand keepable. Also, keeping a hand off of a turn 1 Sol Ring, people will destroy a turn 1 Sol Ring.
It can happen, yeah.
It's just going to happen. Like, there's been hands that I've thought about keeping where I'm like, I've got like 1 or 2 lands, I've got a Sol Ring in here, I've got like some fast mana pieces, but is this hand strong enough to like handle the heat that you get from playing turn 1 Sol Ring?
Yeah, you can't really the turn 1 land tax is not going to get destroyed. There's like almost nothing that does that.
Yeah, like if your turn 1 Sol Ring gets destroyed within the first 3 turns of the game, like you have to think like, am I just out of the game because of that?
And your land tax gets all of its value, like it gets enough value the first turn, whereas Sol Ring like has to stick around for a couple turns. But that's not really, important. But like another thing we want to talk about is, of course land tax is very powerful in turn 1, but like a lot of these cards, land tax included, are even good top decks late game because, especially like land tax. I guess I just want to jump on the fact that deck thinning with fetch lands like isn't very statistically significant, but with land tax, if you have that going for 3 turns, like that's getting rid of 12 cards from your deck, which 12 lands, which like is actually a significant difference in your odds to draw lands.
Yeah, absolutely, and just like being able to fill your hand up more, and especially if you pair that with like rummaging, like we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah.
And so like we're gonna say these cards aren't necessarily amazing if you top deck them late game, but they're at least not useless. Like I think a lot of people would make that argument that 1 and 2 drops are just totally like useless late in the game, so you just shouldn't play too many of them.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with. You've seen people do the thing where they keep like an opening hand and then they skip their land drop and they discard down something to reanimate on turn 2. Like it's not very common, but it happens sometimes. Land tax lets you discard your reanimation targets if you're playing that sort of a deck. If you play it on turn 1, so that's kind of interesting. Another thing you can do to set up your plays.
Yeah, even in like mono white, I like tossing away a couple lands just to have them for like a Sun Titan later on.
Yeah. So
the other card that I would consider possibly it in more like aggressive based decks that I actually have a couple decks that don't play Sol Ring, and this is kind of my Sol Ring in those decks, and it would be Serra Ascendant.
Yeah, of course.
Which is just a crazy card. On turn 1, if it's not answered within the first couple turns of the game, which it typically would be, I would hope most people are playing enough removal in their decks to have an answer within the first couple turns. But having to use that on a 1 mana creature will always feel kind of bad, and you're going to be a little bit up on that.
For sure.
And it can easily deal like up to 20 plus points of damage to your opponents, and then you gain all that life too. So just getting that extra life buffer at the start of the game is huge.
Yeah, and like if someone's if you just choose one person to attack, like you can like make someone play on the back foot so far, and the only cost is you spent 1 mana on the first turn of the game, and it still has to be removed at some point. Like it's not gone, and it like literally half someone's life total, and now they're scared for the rest of the game. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and imagine somebody is playing that adequate amount of spot removal in their deck, but to supplement that, people also play board wipes.
Yeah.
What if somebody only draws their board wipe before they draw their spot removal? Maybe that person has to spend out their board wipe to kill your Serra Ascendant so they don't die.
That's crazy. Yeah, and even in the late game, Serra Ascendant is like I'm just bullshitting, but like I'd say it's like online like after turn like 6 or 7, like 60% of the time, like you don't really go below you're starting your 30 life or whatever, unless your opponents are playing like aggro decks or something very often. And even if you do, like it's still a good blocker. It's like it does its thing. It's really good at like getting reanimated with Sun Titan. It's a great Sun Titan target. I remember I played a game on Magic Online once where I lost off the back of my opponent playing a turn 1 Serra Ascendant, and then it was fine. I dealt with it, and then later in the game they played a Sun Titan, reanimated it. I had to kill both the Sun Titan and the Serra Ascendant, and then they reanimated their Sun Titan, got the Serra Ascendant back, and I was out of removal, and I just I couldn't deal with 4 things.
It's like the Terminator.
Yeah, I only had 3 removal spells, not 4. It was just kind of crazy, but yeah. So it's a house for sure.
Yeah, and even in that situation where, like, say you're playing it in an equipment deck, and you do go under that 30 life, well, you can just start putting all your equipment, like your swords and stuff, on the Serra Ascendant.
Yeah, it's evasive. And
get it back up to that, because it has lifelink, you'll get up to that 30 plus life again, and then it'll get the flying and get huge.
Yep.
So, similar to land tax, we want to talk about Weathered Wayfarer.
Yeah, Weathered Wayfarer is another one of those cards that, like, it's probably not on the Sol Ring power level, but it's at least approaching it, because 1 land Weathered Wayfarer hands are very keepable, and, like, fetching, we've talked about it already, but fetching your non-basic lands like Ancient Tomb and Nykthos, like, kind of does that Sol Ring thing for you a little bit later in the game.
Yeah, and I think this one has extra upside late in the game over land tax. Like, sure, you will need to untap with it, assuming you can't give it haste, which, if you can, that's extra upside over land tax.
Mm-hmm.
Land tax only triggers on your upkeep. This could trigger or you could activate this ability the first turn that you play it. And you can get extra utility lands, such as like War Room or Emeria, Core Haven. Good section here. It's kind of two cards that fulfill a similar role. They're pretty much the same. Mother of Runes or Giver of Runes are just one of my favorite plays to have on turn 1, because it pretty much shuts down like the first piece of spot removal in a turn cycle that would be coming your way.
Yeah.
And it will oftentimes make people use it on your opponents, which is extra great.
Yeah, extra value. And even Mother of Runes, like is even like really backbreaking for your opponents, because it can even protect itself. Like, they can't just shoot Mother of Runes like if it's untapped. They have to have like 2 spells or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and even Giver of Runes not being able to protect itself will still act as a lightning rod for the first piece of removal.
Yeah, and
nice.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to say about this pair of cards is that, like, it's not giving you the, early, 2 mana that a Sol Ring does, but like being able to like curve out and protect your plays, it kind of like sets up your game plan right from the start, is really powerful. I like that a lot.
Especially if your like value pieces in your deck are in the form of creatures.
Yeah.
Being able to keep them alive from spot removal is really big.
Yeah. And even late in the game, like you can make creatures unblockable and stuff to kill people.
Yeah, protection is just a really powerful ability.
Yeah.
And then we have Legion's Landing, which isn't nearly as good as the rest of the cards on this list, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still a nice way for like a white or like a Boros aggressive deck, or just any deck that plays out like low CMC creatures to be able to ramp early in the game.
Yeah, and one thing that like you might not think, oh, this is kind of low impact, but like as you increase the number of 1 mana cost spells in your deck, your consistency goes up. So just finding cards that are like just good enough to be like pretty good, and then throwing them in your deck is going to be pretty nice and powerful. Because the difference between playing a turn 1 Legion's Landing and not playing a turn 1 play is really big.
And we put a few cards per each color that we don't think necessarily would go in every deck of that color, but in specific decks they can really shine and maybe be that piece that you think is something you'd like to have in your opening hand on the level of Sol Ring.
Yeah.
Not quite as powerful, but just something that you're always glad to see.
Yeah, and a good example of this would be like Sigarda's Aid in an equipment deck is obviously very powerful.
Yeah, or Deafening Silence out of Throne of Eldraine. I found that card to always be sneaky good. Like, it never feels like it's doing that much, but I always have people tell me, like, the game after I played it, or like during the game, they're like, I couldn't do this or I couldn't do that because of that Deafening Silence.
Yeah, and the nice thing about like your stacks, like that card coming in on turn 1, is that like it doesn't mess up your curve later in the game. You don't have to fit it in. Like, obviously fitting it in a 1-drop can be easy, but also it can be a little bit difficult because if you're trying to play like directly on curve or hold up 1 mana for like a removal spell, like it can make it a little bit awkward. So getting it on play right away is nice.
Yeah, having a stacks piece on turn 1 or 2 is really important, because I feel like in a lot of fast starts that people have in Commander, you don't have time to stop them by the time it gets to be like turn 3 or 4.
Yeah.
You need to kind of address that
like
right away.
What's the nightmare scenario in a Commander game? Like, everyone's seen the turn 1 Sol Ring into Signet or something opener, and you're just like, oh god, what do I do now? Well, if you play Deafening Silence first, you stop that. They have to take a turn off, like play their Sol Ring, then next turn play their Signet.
Exactly, and also one thing I like about it in aggressive decks is if I go to play my Fairy's Protection on a turn to protect my creatures, and they're trying to Wrath me, they can't counter my spell now.
Yeah,
somebody else could, but it stops people from being able to interact with you as well.
Yeah. And then lastly, we have like the Soul Sisters and Authority of the Consuls as ways to kind of gain some life in some deck that kind of cares about that. Like we were talking about one of the new cards from Kaldheim that has like some life gain payoffs or whatever. But getting these down on turn 1 can often like give you a big buffer of life that lets you like be more aggressive with your attacks or not care like just not just take damage, take hits, not have to block.
Yeah, people always say life gain doesn't provide you any significant value really, but outside of Sarah Ascendant, I've seen a Soul Sister gain upwards of gain more life than just about any card. Like it will gain you upwards of 10 to even, depending on how long it sticks, like maybe up to upwards of 20 life.
Yeah, and it's even a chump blocker later in the game. It can do some synergy things with like being a creature on the field. So it draws cards. With some of your things that draw cards, and you cast creature spells and stuff late in the game. So it can be powerful for sure.
Yeah, it can trigger like additional cards that you have in your deck, stuff like Dawn of Hope or like Archangel of Thune. Like you can have extra synergy with that life gain trigger.
For sure. So that's about all we have for white cards. There were quite a few of them, but that's maybe showing our bias a little bit. But moving on to blue cards, there are definitely some less, I would say, powerful turn 1 plays, but a solid number of really good ones.
Well, they've got one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, one of the best ones, for sure.
I think more so in a competitive setting, but Mystic Remora is probably one of the most powerful turn 1 plays you can have in a game of Commander.
Yeah, for sure. The fish, always does work. It's just playing it on turn 1, like we'll draw. Often it'll draw at least one card right away, and then if you even just pay the 1 mana once, like people are not going to not play their rocks. They're going to play their rocks, and no one can pay 4 mana for it ever. So usually it draws like up to 3 cards. Just like the first 2 turns of the game. Then you can just let it die.
Yeah, let's say, very optimistically, if it's a 1 mana, draw 3, that's crazy. That's Ancestral Recall.
Yeah.
If you have to pay the upkeep cost 1, and it's 2 mana, draw 3, still amazing.
Yeah,
if it's 3 mana, draw 3, or at that point it'd be more 4.
It'd be 4, but yeah.
But still.
It works sometimes.
Fine.
Yeah.
And this is actually a card on this list that I think is almost sometimes better in the late game because people are going to be casting more spells more reliably. And
you have the ability to pay the 1 on the first upkeep even better than like if you played on turn 1 because it's not a big deal. So
and nobody can ever pay the 4 for this. I've never seen it happen. Have you seen it happen?
No, it never happened. I don't think I've ever done it. But yeah, the crazy thing that cards like Mystic Remora do is that like the miracle scenario of you play a Mystic Remora and then your opponent like plays something powerful and then another player is forced to interact with them, so you just like double up on like drawing, and then they have like a counterspell war or something, you drew like 4 cards.
Yeah, and it being at the 1 mana like that, having that cost of they have to pay 4 to stop you from drawing the card, like there's not a lot that can be done about Mystic Remora.
Yeah.
It's just going to get you cards unless it's countered.
Yeah.
But again, it's 1 mana. Feels bad to counter a 1 mana spell.
Mm-hmm. And another card that we think is, pretty good for the, on turn 1 is Mystical Tutor. And with the caveat that, like, you can use Mystical Tutor to keep, like, a 2-land Mystical Tutor, like, ramp hand or something, or, like, a land heavy hand, but by Mystical Tutoring for, like, a windfall or something like that to kind of set yourself up.
Yeah, this one's going to depend more on what your deck is built like, and like what kind of cards you have and what density of effects you have. But also, this is another one that I think is much better later in the game, like being able to get the answer that you need when you need it.
But you can definitely fire off a Mystical Tutor on turn 1 and get a windfall or like a Charted Course or something like that, and just like have it be like a way to draw more lands or something. Or get rid of your 6-land hand. Like, I might keep 6-land Mystical Tutor and then you just get a windfall or something. You could do that.
Yeah.
Be okay. Moving on, we've got we have the kind of more specific decks 1-drops, and that is cantrips. I personally think that cantrips, like Brainstorm, Preordained Ponder, stuff like that, aren't that good in a generic blue deck, but they are very powerful in decks that like care about them.
Yeah, we typically think they're pretty overrated, and people tend to evaluate them as some form of card advantage when they're really not. They're card selection.
Yeah,
but like we said, there are certain decks where you can turn that into a form of extra advantage.
Yeah, like Nivix or like Talrand or something. Things that trigger off of you casting instant sorceries for good value. They become pretty powerful. And they're cards that you can just fire off on turn 1 to kind of sculpt your hand.
Yeah, like I don't know if you played these when you used to have a Kess deck. Like,
yeah.
Being able to play a cantrip twice.
It was pretty nice.
That's good.
Yeah. Playing a Kess is a good example where you just shoot off your cantrip on turn 1, then later in the game you can just spend 1 mana from your graveyard, get another card. Pretty nice.
Yeah, later in the game, even in a regular deck, if you just top deck a cantrip, it's kind of it cycles itself. You know?
For sure. And then moving on, we also have Training Grounds as a very powerful, like this kind of fits into our early synergy piece section. Very powerful 1 mana card that is even better if you play it on turn 1 in certain decks.
Yeah, I think Thrasios being like the main offender, but even we've gotten Kenrith now.
Yeah, for sure.
And any of those abilities, like activated abilities costing 2 less, like that is so significant.
And you can curve a Training Grounds into a Thrasios on turn 2 into, activating it on turn 3, or even if you have like a some sort of fast mana, activating it twice on turn 3. That's kind of ridiculous.
That's absurd.
Yeah. Or even, you can play like a Night Event, just like a Mana Rock on turn 3 and then activate it still. So, yeah. Moving on from blue, I think we're going to black, and black's got some solid choices as well, for sure.
Yeah, not exactly on the level of Sol Ring, because like rituals are a little iffy to play in Commander because they don't provide you any significant like card advantage. Like they don't get you anything on board, and it's a very temporary effect. But Dark Ritual, it's the most efficient ritual in Commander, right?
For sure. At least, for a low mana cost. And the nice thing about turn 1 is if you can play Dark Ritual into some sort of piece that kind of gets you value, so you can kind of make up for that card you lost using the Dark Ritual. So something like a Phyrexian Arena on turn 1 can really pay for itself.
Yeah, just like a form of card draw. Like, oh yeah, Phyrexian Arena, Necropotence, turn 1.
Oh
That's
my god.
Crazy.
Dark Ritual Necropotence. Then you're like, well, I lost, a card from Dark Ritual, but and I don't have a Sol Ring, but I've set myself up like in the game like super crazy.
Yeah, and I know we're making the argument for Dark Ritual based off of the power of other cards, and so that's not to say that Dark Ritual is necessarily like the good part of that factor, but part of the reason we're having this subject is we think people do kind of tend to cut out like the 1 and 2 slot of their deck, so like going straight to 3 on turn 1, even if that puts you behind a card, can often be just like such a big tempo advantage.
For sure. And even Dark Ritual late in the game can let you, making extra mana late in the game is one of those powerful things you can do. So even just extra 2 mana can, be very, very strong for sure.
Yeah, say like your commander is Villas, Broker of Blood, or something like Razaketh. Like people might be preparing to kill it when you have the mana to do it, but playing like a ritual or like playing fast mana out will let you get that out a turn earlier or like 2 turns earlier.
For sure.
And you can really start to assemble your engine from there.
Yep. Moving on, similar to Mystical Tutor that we were talking about, we have Vampiric Tutor / Imperial Seal. Obviously, pretty expensive cards, but like the flexibility of being able to run off a Vampiric Tutor on turn 1 and grabbing fast mana or a combo piece or whatever you need for the game. Sometimes you just get a land, like it happens, but it's really versatile and it sets you up pretty well.
Yeah, good for all the same reasons that Mystical Tutor is, except this one will get you a Mana Crypt, it'll get you a Sol Ring, or like you said, if you kept that 1 land hand, like you can maybe be like, yeah, I'll just go and guarantee that I get my next land drop.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing really wrong with doing that. Like, it doesn't seem very impressive, but it just adds that extra consistency.
And of course, they're very powerful in the late game for sure.
Yeah, gets your win condition.
Yeah. Next, we got a card that you're kind of ticked me off about, not ticked me off, but tipped me off on.
It ticks me off when people exile my graveyard.
For sure.
So, this one, not a super powerful card, but it's nice in that it kind of fills 2 spots on the curve, and it's a Deadeye Tracker. It's a pirate out of Ixalan, or maybe Rivals of Ixalan.
Yeah, I think Rivals.
And it's a 1-mana 1/1. You can pay 1 and a black and tap it to exile 2 target cards from a graveyard, and then you explore. So oftentimes early in the game, people, like we said, might be using cantrips, or they might be using fetch lands and stuff. So you can often probably not totally consistently, But we play with a lot of people that play a lot of fetch lands.
For sure.
So just being able to like exile 2 of their fetch lands and maybe draw a card or throw the top card of your deck into your graveyard if it's too high CMC.
Yeah, it's not a super like efficient or powerful card, but what it does is it fits a slot in your deck for graveyard hate. It kind of does that card advantage thing where you can hit your land drops, and it also sculpts your own graveyard. You can dump creatures and stuff in your graveyard. So it does like 3 things kind of poorly, but being able to do them all is kind of nice, especially coming down on turn 1.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the explore mechanic, and I think graveyard hate. People say this a lot that people should be running it more. But really, I get away with a lot of degenerate stuff in Commander because nobody plays Graveyard Hate, and then when somebody does, I'm like, you son of a bitch.
Exactly. Yeah. So finding more ways to fit in Graveyard Hate that aren't terrible in your deck are pretty nice. Yeah. Now we can talk about some of the more specific, deck archetype cards. Like you have your sack outlets like Viscera Seer and Carrion Feeder. You have your discard outlet like Putrid Imp that come down on turn 1, and if you get these on turn 1, like it threatens to do a lot later in the game is kind of the big thing for those kind of cards.
Yeah, they're oftentimes kind of a combo piece, but also have some utility early in the game, like Viscera Seer. Maybe you'll just end up scrying away sacrificing a couple incidental creatures to get a scry here and there.
Yeah,
make sure you hit your land.
If something gets removed or something, you get that free scry, in response to a removal spell or something. And everyone knows that sack outlets are kind of degenerate in Commander. They can do a lot of really powerful things. But moving along to more deck specific things, we have the enchantments Phyrexian Reclamation and Tortured Existence, which are obviously more geared to specific decks that want to kind of get things back from their graveyard. But having them in play on turn 1 definitely sets you up for the rest of the game. I mean, you've heard me say that like 6 or 7 times this episode, but that's the kind of the point.
Yeah, well, and speaking of that, so these ones are specifically better later in the game when you have more mana or you've spent more resources out. But there's this thing I heard about Limited at one point early on in playing Magic. There's this theory that the player that spends the most mana in a game typically is more favored to win that game.
Mm-hmm.
And there's exceptions to that, especially in Commander, but being able to spend out your mana on turn 1 and 2, we just think it gives you such an advantage, because like if you just hit your land drop pass on turn 1 and 2, you've got 3 mana there that
you're never getting it back. You're never getting it back.
Yeah, and just being able to use that every game, I think will help you a lot.
Yeah. And then we've got a couple more. Blood Chief Ascension as like a card that you can use in certain decks to kind of deal a lot of damage to your opponents. It's like that kind of like early aggression kind of thing. And like Disciple of the Vault in like an artifact synergy. That usually doesn't want to come into play on turn 1, but if you play it on turn 1, like it's there.
Just you play them out turn 1, they're probably better in the later game, but that's fine.
Yeah, if you have a play on turn 1, it's good. So you want to move on to red?
Yeah, starting off, along the lines of land tax, one of my other, maybe I'll keep a 1 land hand with this card, and I probably shouldn't, but I always want to test it every time I have a sketchy hand with this card, and that'd be Faithless Looting, because it's just able to dig you so deep and, sculpt your hand so well within the first 2 turns, and the fact that it has flashback gives you a play on turn 1 and turn 3 from 1 card.
Yeah, and there's a blue card that does this. Careful Study, I think, but that one doesn't have flashback. It's just Faithless Looting, but worse.
Yeah.
So, the nice thing, about even in the late game, Faithless Looting letting you flash it back or even just cast it, to get rid of extra lands or to dig for some piece that you need is really powerful.
Yeah, because I like to play typically a higher land count in my decks to guaranteed hit my land drops. And having just a Faithless Looting, maybe you do it the first time, and then later in the game, you haven't flashed it back on turn 3 because you just had plays to make. But later in the game, you just sandbag a couple lands, and you flash it back, and it helps you get back into the game.
Yeah, and of course, obviously playing, other cards with flashback or graveyard effects is good, Like, there's a couple new cards from Keldheim that have, effects that activate in the graveyard that made me think of Faithless Looting just as being even better than it always was.
Yeah, I think I've done a Faithless Looting before where I'll discard a card or 2 cards with flashback, and then it's just kind of like you drew 2 cards for 1 mana.
Yeah.
In a way.
Discarding, a Deep Analysis or something with a Faithless Looting is awesome. That feels really good because you can just curve that on turn 2 in Deep Analysis and get your card back +1. Yeah, it's awesome.
Makes me want to play Is It?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the rest of the red cards we had, the 1-drops were more specific to a deck archetype. We kind of categorized them that way, and we've got Goblin Welder as one, probably the closest red 1-drops can come to competing with a Soul Ring, I think, on power level, is certain hands with Goblin Welder, where you play a Goblin Welder on turn 1, then on turn 2, you, play something to loot and an artifact, and then you, put into play some huge artifact on turn 2. That can be really powerful, for sure.
Yeah, and this is going to be one that will take a lot more, cards to set it up, kind of like the Dark Ritual thing.
Yeah.
But you can do some really crazy stuff with a Goblin Welder, in Black, we'll talk about, reanimate effects a lot, and just the efficiency of that, but, Goblin Welder allows you to replicate that in red, in an artifact-based strategy.
Yeah, and you can even hit your opponent's artifacts if they have something in the bin. You can get rid of something they have to replace it with whatever they have in their graveyard.
Yeah,
so
it's somebody rummages away or, gets milled and they have, an Everflowing Chalice in their graveyard. You can be you can have that instead of your Soul Ring.
Yeah, or your Gilded Lotus or something. But... yeah, additionally, another card that's pretty cool is Curse of Opulence. We've found that we just had a game just recently that we played where Curse of Opulence on turn 1 or 2 ended up making you 8 mana.
I got
in a couple
at
turns.
Least 8 mana off of it over the course of 2 turns because people are just so greedy to get that gold that they'll attack into the player with it, which is also added upside of that. Your opponent getting attacked is good for you, and getting mana off of just playing that one card, that's really nice.
Yeah. Next we got Fervent Champion as the kind of red equipment 1-drop of choice in probably every equipment deck.
Yeah, I built a Magic Online Fearless Voyager deck, and that's probably one of the best 1-drops in that deck because the ability to play a 2-mana equipment and equip it right away onto that guy, say Sword of the Animist or Mask of Memory.
That is so good.
It allows you to do so much so early in the game. Or even your 3-mana equipments, the Sword of Feast and Famine. You play that down and you immediately have a creature to put it onto.
Yeah, it's really good. And even fine in the late game because it, reduces your mana. It saves you mana, and it also has First Strike, I believe, right?
Yeah. And haste.
Yeah.
I think there was a game where I had all my equipments out and top decked that later on. And yeah, it just picks up all the equipments right away.
And it nets you mana because it reduces. It costs 1 mana and it reduces by 2, right? For each 3. Oh my god.
Yeah, equip costs are 3 less.
Yeah, so you could even. Oh, that's crazy. And then the last card. Do you want to talk about it, Eli?
Oh yeah, this is one that definitely isn't great in the early turns of the game, and it doesn't often it won't make me want to keep an opening hand, but. Like we said, just playing your 1-drop out is fine. It'll attack and block for you. But later in the game, Dragon Master Outcast is a 1-mana token engine for 5/5 dragons once you just hit your land drops and get to 6, or if you ramp even a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of value for 1 mana.
Yeah, and oftentimes Dragon Master Outcast can, kind of be a removal lightning rod for your opponents because if you just play it out in turn 1, it's going to be sitting on the table the whole game, and every turn they're going to be thinking, when he gets to 6 mana, it's going to be kind of bad. Maybe I want to kill it or something. And if your 1-drop gets killed, that's pretty good for you versus your commander or something.
I think that's another big idea from this episode is that just lowering your curve. You can think of so many later game plays where you play this giant creature at 7-8 mana, and it seems so awesome, but it gets removed for 1 or 2 mana.
Yeah.
And you just lose so much tempo from doing that. You can get totally time walked.
Yeah.
So you really want to try and play more high impact 1 and 2 CMC cards.
Yeah, so even if you get time walked later in the game with your expensive spell, you still have other things to fall back on.
Yeah.
So yeah, now we're going to move on to the green cards, everyone's favorite color, green.
Yeah, and green is the color I would say you can most get away with, if you did decide you didn't want to play Soul Ring, people would think you were slightly less crazy than if you said, I have a mono white deck where I don't play Soul Ring.
Yeah.
People probably think that's crazy. But I just decided I didn't want to play it. I wanted to play more artifact hate, like Stony Silence and stuff. But in green, you have such a variety of, things like Exploration and Burgeoning. that lets you play those extra lands out, and everyone agrees with that thing about the social contract that lands are safe. They can't destroy your lands, whereas they will destroy your Sol Ring.
For sure. And like, there are a lot of decks in green that really like have good ways to utilize their land specifically, like, you know, to get them back in the graveyard or have the landfall things, and that makes the sometimes burgeoning or exploration better than a Sol Ring. Especially because it starts adding, like, more... If they stick around, they start, like, going crazy. Like, I had a game I played recently where this guy was playing the new red-green plant guy, the landfall plant guy. Phylath, and he played that on, like, turn 3 because he had a burgeoning, and he kind of just destroyed the game with it.
Yeah, burgeoning will let you oftentimes have 3 or 4 lands by turn 2.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. I mean, you will need card draw to back these cards up, but exploration, one of the strongest starts I think I've ever seen in a game of Commander. A friend of ours has a Tatiova deck, and he played a turn 1 exploration, played his second land. One of the lands was a fetch land. He end-step Worldly Tutors for a Ramanop Excavator.
Oh, no.
And so turn 2, he plays Ramanop Excavator and has a fetch land in his graveyard. So he's always hitting
both
2 land drops from his graveyard, not losing a card. As of turn 2, he has 4 lands in play.
And then next turn he gets to play Tatiova and still have a land drop to play, get 2 draws off it because he has a fetch land. It was really, you know...
Yeah, I came by and I watched him play out that sequence, and I immediately thought, he's winning this game. Walked by a few minutes later, I was like, you win that game? Yeah, he won that game.
Yeah, of course. Other things that you can do on turn 1 in green include Carpet of Flowers. This might be a little bit more played in... Like obviously it's not going to be good in every pod, but a lot of times you have a blue player at the table, and Carpet of Flowers often generates a lot of mana throughout the game. Even the turn you play it, Carpet of Flowers generates the mana on the second main phase on the turn you play it.
Well, I think in a game with a blue player who... You need to have islands specifically for this one.
Yeah.
But this card is better than Sol Ring.
Yeah, oftentimes.
I mean, enchantments are harder to remove than artifacts. Doesn't it give you mana on your first and second main phase?
It's only one of them.
You can choose.
You can
right?
choose, yeah. So if the turn you play it, you can get the mana.
Yeah,
still.
so it's not like it makes your plays more awkward. Like
No.
if you wanted to do something specifically like post combat.
Yeah.
But
so
it gives you colored mana too.
Yeah, and even in the late game, it's like a ritual because you play it, and then your opponent has 3 islands, and it adds 3 mana on your second main phase.
You can get it the
you
turn.
have the turn.
To do
Yep. You go to the
Oh
second
my
main
God.
phase and get it.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, so that card's awesome. Something that I kind of have like a strong love for in my heart is mana dorks in green because obviously they're much more fragile than land ramp cards, but I really enjoy this like green creature like matters kind of theme that you can play out with cards like Orin Frostfang. I think the new Squirrel in the new set also draws a card whenever a creature you control hits somebody.
Yeah.
You get to play cards like Voice of Many, which draw cards for having a bunch of creatures. The mana dorks are fodder for edict effects. You get to kill people with Crater Hoof type stuff. They're blockers in the late game. And they also, even late game, they trigger cards like Zendikar Resurgent and Guardian Project to draw you additional cards off them.
Yeah, they will just cycle themselves. Because speaking of those cards, you know, they are more fragile, but there's also more upside to using creature ramp in a green deck, because green decks have payoffs for having creatures.
Yeah, that's what I love. I really like building decks to utilize cards like that. So I'm very likely to try to build I think usually you want to like decide, like either you play like a bunch of mana dorks or you don't play any mana dorks. I think usually is how the deck building works. I mean, you can play a middling amount, but I tend to like to go all in and play 6 of them or something if I'm playing them.
Yeah, and the thing all these different cards kind of have in common is a thing mostly unique to green outside of using like fast mana pieces. Most colors, or the other colors, can't really go from 1 mana to 3 mana that easily, but there's so many ways to do it in green, and that's just that step. Not that like there's anything wrong with 2 drops, but going from 1 to 3 is just really big. Like that cuts out, that lets you build a really like unique curve. I used to have a Gitrog monster deck where I played a lot of mana dorks because I wanted to play like a Cultivate or a Kadama's Reach on turn 2, and then turn 3 have the Gitrog monster.
Yeah, that's very powerful, of course. And now moving on to some of the more specific, deck cards. Like, I think if anyone's played like Modern or Standard when it was in Standard, you've seen Hardened Scales be like kind of a powerhouse in games. And in Commander too, there's a lot of decks that off of a turn 1 hardened scales can kind of just go crazy and get a lot of value off it.
Yeah, especially if you have like that incremental way to like put +1/+1 counters on
Yeah.
stuff. Like going from like it only adds one more. It doesn't double them, but going from 4 to 5, not that big of a deal. But consistently going from 1 to 2, like always like doubling your value out of that in a +1/+1 counters deck, that can be a really big advantage.
Yeah, and coming out in turn 1 for 1 mana versus 5 for like a doubling season is a big difference. Also, it's much less. Doubling season is like a removal magnet, whereas hardened scales, not so much.
Yeah. And this is kind of a newer card out of, I think, core set 20?
Yes, I think 20.
Elvish Reclaimer kind of allows you for 2 mana and tapping it to do a crop rotation every turn. It lets you sacrifice a land and go and get any land out of your deck. And so this will kind of depend on like how many utility lands you have, but like you can get like a Gaia's Cradle, or you can get a Strip Mine or Fetch Land to do like we were talking about with the Tatiova thing to set up those kind of engines.
Yeah, no, it's really nice. It's obviously better in decks where you have the really high value, probably expensive monetary cost lands like Gaia's Cradle or like like an Urborg Cabal Coffers type thing. But in those kind of decks, like that's going to be a powerful card, and I think it turns into like a 3/3 or later, or like a 3/4. It gets bigger. It gets bigger
about that part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that one pretty nice.
Yeah.
Then we also have Uvenwald Tracker. Not sure if too many people have seen this card, at least recently, but super solid. It's a 1 mana 1/1. You can pay 1 and a green and tap it and make 2 target creatures fight, or one you control and 1 an opponent controls.
Yeah.
Be kind of crazy if you could make your opponent's stuff just fight for 2.
Yeah, that one red card that does that for it's like an instant, but whatever. The thing I like Uvenwald Tracker in decks that play Death Touch commanders. Like I've played a Cheval Bane of Monsters deck. I could see it all right as an okay card in like a more of a casual Glissa deck, because you can just pick off people's creatures and stuff. And even like decks that play like a Managorger Hydra, it's pretty powerful because that's going to fight everything and live. Mm-hmm. So just having that like piece on board to get your to kind of be like a removal piece is pretty nice. Obviously, it's not like the most powerful turn 1 play, but it kind of is nice to play on turn 1, and then it becomes better later.
Yeah, having on board repeatable removal will just be so nice because like there's so many games where you have just too many threats that you have to answer, and you can never afford to spend a card out of your hand every time.
Yeah.
If you play like that, you're not going to win a lot of those games, I don't think, unless you have really good card advantage in your deck.
Yeah, and oftentimes you can find kind of small power creatures, like utility creatures that opponents control, that you can kind of pick off and not lose a creature yourself, like their own 1/1s. All the other cards that we talked about on this list that are creatures, they die to Uvenwald Tracker.
Yeah, this is the card on the list that kills all the other cards on the list.
Exactly.
Except for maybe like Mother of Runes.
Yeah, that one. But I mean, it does. You have you get to play like a cat and mouse game between those two, where you both can't activate them because you'll kill it in response. But that I think that does it for all the green cards. Do you want to move on to some of the colorless artifacts and stuff like that?
Yeah, we had a few artifacts we wanted to talk about, and we tried to specifically avoid like fast mana cards because the idea is like saying like, oh, this is better than Soul Ring.
Mana Crypt.
Obviously, Mana Crypt is better than Soul Ring.
Yeah.
That's an easy argument to make. So we're not going to talk about stuff like that specifically. But one, we're not a huge fan of this card, but people will play it a lot, and it does have some value, is Sensei's Divining Top.
Yeah.
We'll just kind of, again, let you sculpt your first couple draws a little bit. It's not... I think a lot of people get this idea that it's some form of card draw.
Yeah.
Because of its activated ability, but it's not. You're going to have to draw that Sensei's Top again, so...
Yeah, you're really down a card with Sensei's Top, and the times where you want to play it in your deck, I think, are the decks where you can kind of turn it into like a combo piece. Like with Bolas' Citadel, it's kind of... And like with Bolas' Citadel, like turns into like draw your deck. Or like with cards that draw they when you draw a card when you play an artifact or something, you can kind of
like a Joyra Weather, like
you can get a card every turn off of it or something.
Yeah.
So that's in those decks especially, it's really strong.
And then we have Wayfarer's Bauble. I think it's also another card that's maybe been a little bit overhyped at this point, but it's still super solid.
Yeah, I'm happy with the Wayfarer's Bauble, especially in decks like Rakdos decks and stuff like that probably want to do something like that.
Yeah, and like we were saying about spending out your mana, it gives you something to play on turn 1 and then turn 2. I think a lot of people would evaluate it as like, I don't want to pay 3 mana to search a land in a play. But really, you're mostly going to be playing it on turn 1, hopefully.
Yeah, and it's probably just a little bit better. If you play it on turn 1, it's probably a little better than playing a Mana Rock on turn 2. Because obviously a land in play is probably better than a Mana Rock most of the time.
Or even some games you might not need that on turn 2. You might have a Mana Rock you want to play or another 2-drop, and you can just sit on that and use your mana on a later turn when you don't have a play to make.
Yeah, and like I mentioned a moment ago with like a Glissa deck or something, it is a recurable card that you can get back from your graveyard if you need to hit more lands and stuff. So that's kind of the upside versus a Mana Rock.
Yeah, I love it in my Gisela deck with like Sun Titan or even Emiria Shepherd. Like with Emiria Shepherd, you can get it back by playing a Plains and then use it for 2 mana.
Get a Plains,
get it back, or you kind of do that.
Yeah, as much mana as you have, you can just do a bunch of things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Similarly to Wayfarer's Bauble is Expedition Map. Now this won't ramp you necessarily, but being able to tutor a land into your hand, like you could use it for ramp. You could get Ancient Tomb off of it.
Yeah.
I've done that sometimes.
For sure.
Or you could get just a Myriad Landscape for later.
Yeah, but
it's kind of a slower paced game.
Kind of like we were talking about with Elvish Reclaimer a moment ago, decks that have like really powerful, lands in their deck, like a Gaia's Cradle or like a Cabal Coffers or something, are going to be happy. They want another copy of that in their deck, and Expedition Map does that on turn 1.
Yeah.
And then you activate it on turn 2. And
a lot
then you get
of utility.
Yep. So that just about does it for our short list of 1-drops. And like we mentioned earlier, I want to say you really can find yourself, going up from 8% about just having a Soul Ring in your deck to like 30% having 5 or so good 1-drops in your deck. And I think if you pick from this list of 1-drops, you can pretty easily get 5 or more 1-drops that are going to be powerful in the early game and powerful in the late game.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the key thing to keep in mind, I guess, for why we like 1-drops so much is that they are like plays that you play right away that set you up for the rest of the game. It would be harder to make this episode for 2-drops because there's so many more like good 2-drops that exist in Commander, and also people know to play 2-drops. But we do want to kind of mention a little bit a couple categories of 2-drops to kind of give you a heuristic of which types of 2-drops you want to play to set yourself up for the rest of the game.
Yeah, like some different categories we have here of like the type of stuff that you might want to play more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the common knowledge has kind of adapted to this by now, where your ramp really should be 2 mana or less, ideally.
Yeah. And if your card is your 2-drop is one of these categories, it's probably gonna be good at any point in the game. So yeah, like you mentioned, mana should be 2 mana. So we think that Mana Rocks obviously are very powerful. Cards like Arcane Signet and stuff like that. Great 2-drops you can play.
Yeah, the Signets, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone.
Yeah.
Green Ramp. Green has a variety of 2 mana search a land into play cards. Mm-hmm. We just got 3 Visits reprinted, which will get a land untapped even.
Oh my god.
So that's amazing.
Yeah, in other colors you have like Knight of the White Orchid and stuff. In a couple other colors you have some things that do that.
Yeah, or even also in green you've got Sakura Tribe Elder, which has that additional utility of being able to block. You could recur it a bunch of times.
Yep.
I think out of the 2 mana ramp cards, Sakura Tribe Elder might be one of my favorites.
One of the best for sure.
I'll play it over a Rampant Growth.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also get some just like next level mana dorks that provide additional mana or additional utility, like Bloom Tender.
Yeah,
is just an insane magic card.
One of the most powerful mana dorks in the format for sure.
I'm glad I haven't seen more of Bloom Tender.
And then like similarly, not quite mana dorks, but other cards that on turn 2 can get you mana in the form of reduction, like Ethereum Sculptor, or in red, I guess you can play like Generator Servant that can get you some mana.
Yeah, it gets you kind of a burst of mana. It's kind of a ritual effect.
Yeah, obviously those ones, or especially Generator Servant's not as good, but like we're trying to find cards in all the colors to mention if we can.
I used to be such a big Generator Servant fan. That was my favorite thing to use to play a Sun Titan and then give the Sun Titan haste, bring back the Generated Servant and something else.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But then also on 2 mana, you've got other forms. You've got card advantage that you can generate early in the game.
And this fits into the theme of like selling yourself up for the game, because if you have like a card advantage engine on turn 2, you're going to be able to hit your land drops, hit your spells, do what you need to do. So first of all we've got these creatures that generate card advantage, like Dark Confidant and Mindblade Render as ways to draw a card every turn. Ghostly Pilferer is a blue card that ends up drawing, probably 3 cards in the game at least, probably pretty quickly. Yeah,
like Argothian Enchantress, just being able to cycle through your enchantments more and not go down cards when you play spells.
Mm-hmm.
Along the lines of like blue, like has like 2 mana looter creatures. Sometimes I've been really hoping for a 2 mana red looter for the longest time, but right now we have Magmatic Channeler, which isn't quite that, but its ability to go too deep when you discard a card can be nice sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Stoneforge Mystic will tutor you up oftentimes like a Skull Clamp.
Yeah, and that's like it's mana neutral, and then it can get you not mana neutral, sorry, card neutral, and then it gets you advantage for late game. Then you also have like the like cantrip creatures like Baleful Strix and like Dusk Legion Zealot and Wall of Omens and stuff like that, which
Wall of Omens, those creatures that just ETB draw you a card.
Yeah, they at least can get you to like your lands if you need them, and they can maybe be flickered later in the game or something. Cards like Humble Defector and Pierce Steel Paladin, SRAM, stuff like that. There's a ton of 2 mana creatures that generate value.
And I'd say perhaps the best of all of these, in my opinion, would be Sylvan Library.
Yeah, and that transition us into the non-creature like advantage, where Sylvan Library is like, oh my god, it's so good. It's really expensive, though.
Yeah, really expensive. I mean, it got reprinted in the Commander Collection Green, but that is also really expensive and hard to come by.
If you play on Magic Online, that card's like cents on the dollar, so pick that one up.
Play Sylvan Library on Magic Online. And you know what? Just always pay the 8.
Yeah, a lot of times you do pay the 8.
You got 40 life. You can do it.
Yeah, it's fine.
4 times, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a couple more non-creature things that are going to be okay that draw cards, like Argyl's Bloodfast and the single.
You can play one off. Not everything has to be like a super like long game value play. Like playing a Night's Whisper, Sign in Blood, or something like Chart a Course. Just spending 1 card to go to 2 cards will help dig you into your land drops or just more plays later in the game. And those never feel terrible to top deck because you can always replace them and go up a card.
Yeah, and usually you don't want to play your like card draw on turn 2 if you have another turn 2 play. Card draw spells like Chart a Course are playable on turn 2 if you have nothing else, and then they progress your game plan. So that's what's nice about them.
Exactly.
And speaking of progressing your game plan, we've got a section called proactive cards, and this kind of means a couple different things. The first thing that I think of when I think of proactive cards is like hate bears and stuff like that kind of stop your opponent. They're things you play onto the board to stop people from doing things.
Yeah, they advance your board state.
Yeah.
And also, in the case of hate bears, will hamper your opponents.
Yeah.
So like having a
excuse me.
What's he called? The 2 mana white Grand Abolisher. My guy.
Yeah, your guy. Or like a Drannith Magistrate or something.
Oh my god, yeah, Drannith Magistrate.
Yeah.
Probably one of the best hate.
Yeah, you might call those reactive cards, but the point of this is that you play them like on turn 2 and before your opponent does something. So that's why I would call them proactive for sure.
Yeah, you're taking advantage of the time that you have earlier in the game.
Yep. And then sticking on to that kind of bear kind of theme, you've got cards like Scavenging Ooze, which aren't really hate bears, but they will it's an early play that lets you kind of check your opponent's graveyards with its graveyard hate ability, and it also plays that double theme of being an aggressive attacker, which is our other proactive card section.
Yeah, these kind of cards will just allow you to have a trick on board that will make your opponents have to play differently, or in the case of stuff like Drannith Magistrate, they won't be able to play certain things.
Yeah,
or like Athalia or something. Like it will affect their ability to react, and they will have to they'll have to think more, and they'll make more mistakes based off of that, I think.
Yeah, so if you're like an aggro deck or something, if you have like a card like a Loyal Apprentice, like that's going to get in a lot of damage early. Other than that, I don't know if there's too many good like 2-drop aggressive creatures, like aggressive like in combat. But I mean, I'm sure there's some middling ones that you can look and put in your deck.
Yeah, well, the idea with hate bears too is
I
always think it's they attack, so it's always more important to me to have a creature that has some kind of useful utility or effect on it than it is to just have like a big creature.
Yeah.
But I had this history teacher in 8th grade that always had this saying when he was talking about like the old battles and like the early settlement of America and stuff, with like specifically like with muskets and stuff. He'd say, well, if you'd shoot your musket and you wouldn't have a bullet anyway, so you turn it around and now you got a baseball bat. So that's kind of how I look at like utility creatures and stuff. Like say somebody plays a Linvala on you, or plays something like humility, like some kind of effect that stops your abilities from working on the creature, or they're just not doing anything for you on that board state. Well, if your gun's out of bullets, you still got a baseball bat.
For sure. You can just swing in.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, so our last little category of 2-drops that we think are going to be powerful is it's titled Synergy, but it really kind of just boils down to the rest of the good 2-drops. So like utility cards like Lightning Greaves, or like the Seal of Primordial Seal, whatever those cards are called.
Seal
like
of Cleansing.
Seal of Cleansing, all of the Black Seal as well. All these cards are like things you can play proactively on the board on turn 2, even if there's no target for them, and like fire them off later in the game. Like I said, Lightning Greaves and like Swiftfoot Boots and stuff are good cards to get in early to progress your game plan. And then the other section was combo pieces. You want to talk about some combo pieces?
Yeah, so we've got stuff like Thopter Foundry, which I haven't seen a lot of this in Commander, but that's even just like outside of being a combo piece, a decent value piece.
Yeah.
Or Walking Ballista also is just a good creature. Like I played that in my Tajik deck without any combo pieces with it really, because it's just like you mentor onto it, you put counters on it some other way, and then it's just removing other utility creatures like Mana Dorks and stuff.
And the nice thing about Thopter Foundry and Walking Ballista, at least Walking Ballista, is like usually a lot of the combos that involve it just want it to be in the graveyard and they get it back, so you can just kind of fire it off on turn 2 and then shoot the dork or something if you need to. And then like later in the game it's in the graveyard, you can get it back with something. Or, some decks just want it on the field, like with Heliod, that it doesn't need to be like more than a 1/1.
Yeah. Yeah,
for it to go infinite. And then cards like Goblin Bombardment and stuff.
Yeah, similarly, Goblin Bombardment, it's mainly thought of as a combo piece, but sack outlets do have a lot of value to them. But this is one that also allows you to shoot down your opponent's creatures. So I think, when I'm thinking of sack outlets, I'm biased as a red-white player primarily, but I think Goblin Bombardment is my favorite. I think it's the best.
Yeah. So that's about all of our 2-drops we were going to talk about. Like, we wanted to say, I think part of making this episode was really fun to kind of look at all of these cards and be like, man, I love a lot of these cards. And so I would recommend personally, informally recommending somewhere in the ballpark of like 15 or so or more things that you can do before turn 3, not counting cards like Counterspell or Swords of Plowshares or something like that. So you can kind of like just get a start on the game early. And like you might think, wow, 15 things that are going to be bad in the late game, that's a lot. But like cards, these card advantage 2-drops and stuff like that we've been mentioning aren't really bad in the late game. They come and play later and they replace themselves with other things, or they affect the board, or they do something good. So yeah, I think you'd be a lot happier playing a lot of 2 and 1 drops in your deck.
Yeah, and I think somewhat my deck building has influenced like how I see this, because two of my favorite decks have 3 mana commanders. So in those decks, I decided I didn't want to play a lot of 3 CMC spells, because I always have that to play on turn 3, and my commanders in those decks are always good to play on turn 3. So I prioritize putting a lot of emphasis on the 2 mana slot, because that will always give me a play within the first 3 turns of the games. I can always have like 2 permanents on board.
Yeah, and I ran some statistics on if you have 15 proactive 1 or 2 drops in your deck. If you don't mulligan, if you just like draw the first 9 cards of your deck, meaning like go to 8 on turn 1, go to 9 on turn 2, the odds that you have at least 2 lands and a thing to play for 1 or 2 mana is with 15 things in your deck is 70%. That's pretty good, I would say. I'm pretty happy with those odds.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about Magic is the deck building aspect. And sure, it's random, but being able to control like some aspects of the randomness through your deck building, I find as a really fun challenge. Like I was saying about those decks I play, I play a ton of 2 CMC cards in my Tajik Legion's Edge deck, so I can guaranteed have that, not necessarily the same card because it's a singleton format, but I have a similar play experience almost every game that I play because of that.
Yeah, and not to say like the deck plays the same every time, but like having that like be able to play a 1-drop or a 2-drop really early, like just it's really satisfying. So I would really recommend. It's a lot of fun, when you can just play your spells. To play your spells. So really try to get some of these in your deck, and I think you'll be happier overall.
Or if you're really lucky, maybe you found a 2 CMC commander that you like and you can play, and then you really don't have to worry about that much at all. You have a 2-drop every game.
Yeah,
it's really nice to
like
have
I was talking, I had a Cheville deck, and that deck plays a lot of 1 mana cross creatures and stuff, but like not too many 2-drops. All my 2-drops are removal.
Yeah, you can really, like, depending on the CMC of your commander, cut out that slot in your curve and just pad around it.
Yep.
But another thing we want to talk about, maybe more so in depth in a later, like, smaller episode, but with Kaldheim coming out soon, they have the new foretell mechanic, and we both really like it, or at least I do.
I like it.
You like it, right, Spencer?
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it.
In that, like, it allows you to, earlier in the game, you can foretell a card for 2 mana.
Yeah.
And then play it on a later turn for a lower mana cost, typically, than its converted mana cost.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just another way to spend out your mana on that turn 2, because like we said, if you don't spend your mana on turns 1 and 2, you're not getting it back.
Yeah, so every foretell card you put in your deck kind of gets you closer to that 15 or more kind of ballpark I was recommending. For you to play in your decks. And that's really nice because skipping turn 2 just feels bad.
Yes.
And foretell, you don't always have to, like if you have like a better 2-drop to play on turn 2, you can just play that. You don't have to foretell that early. But it lets you have that extra card in your deck that lets you fill that curve.
Yeah, and obviously, even with this look on deck building, or this mentality, you're still going to have hands, you're just going to have bad mulligans where you won't draw like a 1-drop or a 2-drop, and that's always going to feel bad. But at least this way you can reduce the amount of games where you feel like a non-entity.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to say about that is one benefit of playing a lot of low-cost spells is that it makes your mulligans better, because if you have to mulligan to 6 or 5 cards, if you mulligan, you get to like pitch more lands to the bottom. If you can mulligan to 2 lands and like a Dark Confidant, you're going to be fine. Like that's all right. Or like 1 land tax and like a couple spells, like that's fine. So that's why I really like playing a lot of low cost spells. It makes your mulligans better too.
Yeah, I mean, what's one big thing that Magic players love to complain about? It's being mana screwed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're getting mana screwed, which like we've talked about on the last episode and a little bit on this one, play more lands first. It'll happen less, but lower your mana curve too,
and mulligan more.
And and you won't feel so bad about it.
Yep. So I think that's about all we have to talk about for today, right?
Yeah. Hopefully we covered everything, and we will be back early next month. Hopefully,
yeah, we're gonna look to try to do maybe about 2 episodes a month, once every 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, we're hopefully gonna try and do a little take on some Kaldheim cards coming up soon.
Yep.
But yeah, I've been Elijah Samuelson.
And I've been Spencer Cook.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Yep, thanks.